Russia has lost over 1 million soldiers and still can't take one city. The shocking truth about the war in 2026. 1 million human beings gone from the battlefield in less than 4 years, and yet the war grinds on Russia, throws wave after wave of men into Ukrainian territory, gaining ground. So slowly, analysts are measuring it in city blocks, not cities, not regions, city blocks. So here's the question that no one in power wants to answer. If 1 million soldiers were not enough to win this war, what will it take? And more importantly, who is going to pay the price? Welcome and thank you for being here on the Professor Jiang Report, where we cut through the noise and bring you the facts, clearly and with respect for your intelligence. If this is your first time joining us, we would love for you to subscribe and become part of a community that values truth, depth, and honest analysis of the world's most important events. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from today? Whether you are in North America, Europe, Asia, or beyond, this story touches all of us, and your perspective matters here. Here is the complete Part 1 script for the Professor Jiang Report. Part 1. Main facts and background. The numbers are staggering and they are verified. According to estimates shared by senior Western officials in early 2026, Russia has now suffered more than 1 million military casualties since it launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. That number includes soldiers who were killed and soldiers who were wounded so badly they could no longer fight 1 million people from a single country in less than 4 years. To understand how the world arrived at this moment, viewers need to go back to the beginning. On February 24th, 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered his armed forces to cross into Ukraine. His government called it a special military operation. The Kremlin told the Russian people it would be over quickly. Some Russian officials openly expected Ukrainian resistance to collapse within days. It did not. Ukraine's military, backed by weapons and intelligence from the United States, the United Kingdom, and European allies, held the line. They pushed Russian forces back from the capital, Kiev, in the early weeks of the war. And from that moment forward, the conflict turned into something neither side had fully planned for a long, grinding, brutal war of attrition. Russia shifted its focus to the eastern and southern regions of Ukraine, particularly the Donbass, a heavily industrialized area that Moscow had long claimed as its political and historical priority. They captured territory, street by street, village by village, but the cost was enormous. According to data published by the Institute for the Study of War and Ukraine's own open-source intelligence group Deep State, Russian forces gained a net total of just 12 square miles of Ukrainian territory in the 4 weeks between late May and late June 2026. To put that in perspective, that is roughly half the size of Manhattan Island. For 1 million casualties, 12 square miles, military analysts described Russia's advance as glacial. At the same time, Russian desertion rates began climbing. Ivan Chuvalyayev, a representative of Aidit Lesem, a group that helps Russian soldiers flee the military, told Al Jazeera that the longer Russia's advance stalled, the higher the number of men requesting to desert. The human cost was not limited to soldiers. Since the war began, at least 16,126 civilians have been confirmed killed inside Ukraine, including nearly 800 children, according to the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission. Entire cities were damaged. Millions of Ukrainians were displaced, and yet Ukraine continued to resist. By 2026, the war had entered its 5th year. Russia still controlled significant portions of eastern and southern Ukraine, including parts of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, and the Crimean Peninsula. But full control of even a single major city like Kostiantynivka remained out of reach. The question that military experts, world leaders, and ordinary people were all asking was the same: how long can this continue, and at what cost? Here is the complete Part 2 script for the Professor Jiang Report. Part 2. Important rules and current details. Something remarkable is happening in this war right now, and most people have not fully grasped it yet. For the first time in modern military history, a smaller nation is using low-cost drone technology to strike deep inside one of the world's largest countries, reaching targets nearly 2,000 miles from its own border. This is not science fiction. This is June 2026, and it is changing everything about how this war is being fought. Let's walk through exactly what is happening on the ground right now. On the night of June 26, 2026, Ukraine launched one of the largest drone attacks in the entire history of this conflict. Russia's own defense ministry confirmed that its air defense systems intercepted 660 Ukrainian drones in a single night. Those drones targeted 12 Russian regions simultaneously, including Moscow, Russian-occupied Crimea, the Black Sea, and the Sea of Azov. Ukraine's security service struck 2 Russian naval reconnaissance ships, the Volga and the Vyatka. Along with a cargo ferry in the port city of Kerch in Crimea, fires were reported across multiple sites. This was not a random escalation. Hours before the attack, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky made a public announcement. He stated that he had personally approved what he called a 40-day influence operation, directed by Ukraine's security service against Russia. The stated goal was clear: to apply enough pressure on Moscow to compel it to end the war. That single decision triggered the largest drone barrage Ukraine had ever launched, and it came at a moment when Russia's own military position was quietly deteriorating. Here is what the verified data shows. According to Ukraine's deep state open source intelligence group, one of the most widely cited tracking organizations in this conflict, Russia's rate of territorial gain has been slowing consistently through 2026. In the 4 weeks ending June 23rd, Russian forces captured a net total of approximately 12 square miles of Ukrainian land. The previous 4-week period had shown gains of 21 square miles. The direction of travel is downward. Meanwhile, Ukraine has been systematically targeting Russian supply infrastructure. Bridges connecting Kherson Oblast to Crimea were repeatedly struck by drones throughout June 2026. Oil depots in Luhansk, Novorossiysk, and Ust-Labinsk were set on fire. Port facilities in Mariupol and Berdyansk were damaged. The strategy behind these strikes is not simply destruction. Ukrainian military planners are targeting the arteries that keep Russian forces supplied, fuel, ammunition, and equipment. Without those supply lines, frontline Russian units become harder to sustain. The United Nations Security Council addressed this situation directly in a formal briefing in late June 2026. Senior UN officials confirmed that May 2026 had recorded more Ukrainian civilian deaths caused by short-range drones than any single month since the war began in February 2022. First-person view drones, small, cheap, and camera-equipped, were identified as the leading cause of civilian harm along the front line. Both sides were using them. Both sides were suffering. Because of them, NATO also released updated figures showing that allied nations had committed more than $6 billion in military equipment to Ukraine through what is called the Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List. That program was specifically designed to ensure a steady flow of critical supplies, particularly air defense systems, directly to Ukrainian forces. The official position of the NATO alliance, stated publicly by Secretary General Mark Rutte, was unambiguous. Ukraine's security, he said, is closely linked to the security of every NATO member. Support would not stop. What all of this tells the viewer is that this war in 2026 is no longer being fought only on a physical front line. It is being fought in the skies over Moscow, in the oil fields of southern Russia, in the ports of occupied Crimea, and in the budgets and boardrooms of 32 NATO nations simultaneously. The battlefield has expanded beyond anything the world expected in February 2022, and the rules of this conflict are being rewritten in real time. Here is the complete Part 3 script for the Professor Jiang Report. Part 3, Consequences and Implications. There is a number that historians will study for generations: 1 million. That is not a statistic from a distant century. That is not a figure from the First World War or the Second. That is the number of Russian soldiers killed or wounded in a conflict that is still ongoing right now, in the year 2026. And when a nation loses 1 million of its own people in a single war, the consequences do not stay on the battlefield. They travel home, they sit at dinner tables, they walk into hospitals, orphanages, and unemployment offices. They reshape an entire country from the inside out. Let's examine what that actually looks like. Starting with Russia itself. Russia entered this war with one of the largest standing armies on Earth. Its military was considered by many analysts to be among the top 5 most powerful forces in the world. 4 years later, independent researchers at Mediazona and Meduza, 2 of Russia's most credible investigative outlets, both operating outside the country, had identified and confirmed by name more than 219,000 Russian soldiers killed in action as of August 2025. That number represents only confirmed, individually verified deaths. The true figure, Western governments believe, is significantly higher. Former CIA Director William Burns stated in early 2026 that total Russian casualties, killed and wounded combined, had reached approximately 1,100,000. The United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense placed the figure even higher, at 1,168,000 by December 2025. These are not partisan claims. These are assessments from some of the world's most experienced intelligence communities. Now consider what those numbers mean for Russian society. Russia's working-age male population has been under extraordinary pressure since 2022. Hundreds of thousands of men, many of them young, educated, and economically productive, either died in Ukraine, were severely wounded, or fled Russia to avoid military conscription. Independent analysts estimate that more than 1 million Russians left the country in the months following Putin's September 2022 mobilization order alone. That represents a brain drain of historic proportions. Engineers, doctors, teachers, and entrepreneurs gone. The economic consequences followed quickly. Russia's economy, already under the weight of sweeping Western sanctions, began showing serious structural cracks by 2026. Energy revenues, which form the backbone of the Russian federal budget, came under sustained pressure as Ukrainian drones repeatedly targeted oil refineries, fuel depots, and export infrastructure. The Economist estimated in May 2026 that energy blackouts caused by Russian attacks inside Ukraine had cut Ukrainian economic growth by 2.5 percentage points. But the damage to Russia's own energy sector from Ukrainian long-range strikes was also mounting steadily. Inside Russia, public sentiment was shifting in ways the Kremlin could not fully control. A survey cited by Russia, Matters in June 2026, showed that 60% of Russians expressed support for peace negotiations. That figure, in a country where state media dominates the information landscape and dissent carries serious legal risk, is extraordinary. It suggests that the human cost of this war is penetrating even the most tightly controlled information environments. For Ukraine, the consequences have been no less severe. More than 250,000 Ukrainian soldiers were killed or wounded, according to the same senior Western official estimates from February 2026. At least 16,126 Ukrainian civilians were confirmed dead, including nearly 800 children. Entire regions of the country had been left without power, heat, or water during winter months, as Russia systematically targeted energy infrastructure. The United Nations described the civilian harm in May 2026 as the worst recorded in any single month since the war began. Yet Ukraine did not collapse. Its government continued functioning. Its military continued innovating. Its drone program evolved from a defensive tool into a strategic weapon capable of reaching targets nearly 2,000 kilometers inside Russian territory. That resilience carries its own set of implications. It tells the international community that Ukraine intends to fight until its terms are met, not until it runs out of strength. It signals to Moscow that time and attrition are no longer automatically working in Russia's favor, and it presents Europe and the United States with a fundamental question that has no easy answer. At what point does supporting Ukraine become more dangerous than negotiating an end to the war? And at what point does negotiating an end to the war become more dangerous than continuing to support Ukraine? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the exact questions sitting on the desks of leaders in Washington, Berlin, Paris, and London right now. The consequences of this war are no longer confined to Eastern Europe. They are reshaping energy markets, military budgets, diplomatic alliances, and the basic rules of how nations relate to one another in the 21st century. What happens next in Ukraine will not stay in Ukraine. Here is the complete Part 4 script for the Professor Jiang Report. Part 4, Viewer Engagement and Future Outlook. Now it is time to bring this story home because everything covered in this report, the 1 million casualties, the drone strikes reaching the Ural Mountains, the stalled peace talks, the collapsing supply lines, the shifting public opinion inside Russia, all of it leads to one place, the future. And the future of this war is something every person watching this report has a right to understand clearly and honestly. So let's start with the questions that matter most. Here is the first question for viewers to reflect on and share in the comments below. If Russia has sacrificed 1 million soldiers and gained only a fraction of the territory it originally claimed as its goal, at what point does a military campaign become impossible to justify to its own people? Think about that carefully, because history shows that wars do not always end when one side runs out of weapons. Sometimes they end when one side runs out of will, and the polling data coming out of Russia in June 2026 suggests that will is under serious pressure. The second question is equally important. Ukraine has shown extraordinary resilience and military innovation across 4 years of war. But resilience has limits. With more than 250,000 of its own soldiers killed or wounded and civilian infrastructure under continuous attack, how long can Ukraine sustain this level of conflict without a political resolution that secures its future? These are not questions with simple answers, but they are questions that the world's most respected analysts, diplomats, and military strategists are actively wrestling with right now. So what do experts believe comes next? Several developments are already on the horizon, and viewers should watch them closely. The NATO summit in Ankara, Turkey, scheduled for July 7th and 8th, 2026, is the single most important diplomatic event on the immediate calendar. 32 allied nations will gather to make decisions that will directly shape the next phase of this conflict. Key items on the agenda include whether Ukraine's support package will be formally embedded into NATO members' long-term defense budgets, what operational framework will govern Ukraine's use of F-16 fighter jets against Russian territory, and whether the alliance will adopt a new defense spending target of 5% of GDP by 2035. Each of those decisions carries enormous consequences for how this war evolves through the remainder of 2026 and beyond. At the same time, Zelensky's 40-day influence operation, the same operation that triggered the 660 drone barrage on June 26th, is still running. That operation is designed specifically to increase pressure on Moscow and force a change in Russia's negotiating position. Whether it succeeds or fails will likely become clear before the end of July 2026. On the peace talks front, the picture remains deeply complicated. 3 rounds of trilateral negotiations between the United States, Ukraine, and Russia have taken place in Abu Dhabi and Geneva. Without a breakthrough on the core territorial questions, Russia continues to demand full control of the Donbass region. Ukraine continues to refuse any unilateral military withdrawal. The United States continues to apply pressure on both sides while managing its own competing foreign policy priorities. Carnegie Endowment analysts describe the negotiations in February 2026 as having multiple tracks: military, political, economic, territorial, and security guarantees, but warned that progress on any single track depends entirely on progress across all the others. In plain terms, everything is connected and nothing is simple. For viewers who want to stay genuinely informed on this story as it develops, here are the most reliable resources to follow. The Institute for the Study of War publishes daily battlefield updates with verified maps and sourced analysis. The Kyiv Independent provides on-the-ground reporting directly from Ukrainian journalists. The United Nations Security Council releases official briefing transcripts after every Ukraine session. Russia Matters, published through Harvard University, produces weekly verified casualty and territorial data drawn from multiple independent sources. These are not partisan outlets. They are institutions with established editorial standards and verifiable track records. Bookmark them, return to them regularly, because this story will continue to develop rapidly in the weeks ahead. And here is the final thought that the Professor Jiang Report wants to leave with every viewer today. 1 million is not just a number. Behind that figure are 1 million families, 1 million mothers who received news they were never prepared to receive, 1 million empty chairs at tables across Russia and Ukraine, 1 million lives that will never continue. Wars are decided by generals and politicians, but they are paid for by ordinary people. And as the world watches this conflict move toward whatever ending awaits it, the most important thing any informed citizen can do is refuse to look away. Refuse to let the scale of this tragedy become background noise. Ask the hard questions, demand honest answers, and hold those in power accountable for the decisions they make in the name of nations and people who never asked for this war. This has been the Professor Jiang Report. Thank you for watching, thank you for thinking, and thank you for caring enough to stay informed. If this report gave you something valuable today, please share it with someone who needs to understand what is truly happening in the world right now. Subscribe to the Professor Jiang Report so you never miss a story that matters, and leave your thoughts, your questions, and your location in the comments below. Because in a world full of noise, your voice still counts. Until next time, stay informed, stay grounded, and stay human.